The Romantics had passion, but no plan. The most radical response to the Industrial Revolution, that of the Socialists, began with the opposite problem: a plan, but no passion. That is, the early Socialists were all reasonable men, also descendants of the Enlightenment, who constructed utopias in their heads and hoped that the rest of the world would be persuaded by sweet reason. As we'll see, the immediate response from governments and factory owners amounted to a mild yawn. It was only when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels combined socialist reason with romantic passion that the socialist idea took off. First, some genesis and definitions. If the word liberal has loaded connotations, what are we to make of the word socialist? The word has taken on such negative connotations in America that to be labeled a socialist is surely the quickest road to political marginalization. But in fact, it could be argued that many early societies practiced a form of socialism. They kept property in common, all worked for the good of the community, all received as to their needs as a matter of survival. Early Neolithic communities, early Christian communities worked like this. But socialism first emerged as a coherent philosophy in the early 19th century as a response to the Industrial Revolution. Early socialist writers agree with the classical liberals that everyone should have the vote and the press should be free. But like Mill, they also argue that such amenities would be useless if the voters and readers of that press were sunk in poverty, coerced by their bosses, illiterate, miserable. But early socialists go farther. They argued that it was neither natural nor fair that 1% of the population owned 35% of the wealth. They argued that it was neither natural nor fair that one man or one family could own the land, the trees, the lakes, the coal, the iron or cotton, when these are clearly the produce of nature. They argued that it was neither natural nor fair that one man or one family could own the factories, the railways, the shipping companies, given that they affected so many people's lives. Socialists advocate the common ownership of natural resources and the means of production and distribution, the factory, the transportation companies. Note that this is a little different from the common perception. 19th century socialists didn't want to take away your cow or your car or your Discman or your MP3 player. Personal possessions and as private property were okay. It's the big things, the things that you and I mostly don't own, that they were after. Now, the earliest of these advocates of socialism were so optimistic about how to achieve their utopias that they've been dubbed utopian socialists, which should tell you something about their success. Like the Romantics, they were not terribly practical. Their goal was to persuade the upper and middle classes to relinquish ownership of the natural resources and means of production voluntarily or through government action. In short, they were doomed. Now, the Count Henri de Saint-Simon is often credited with originating socialism. He saw it as a logical outgrowth of Christianity. He published The New Christianity in 1825. He believed that industrialization could be a force for good if organized along Christian principles. He urged the state to organize the common exploitation of resources, directed by scientists and intellectuals. He also originated the famous phrase, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his work." But these ideas attracted few takers. Charles Fourier believed that social harmony would result if society were organized into small communities of about 1,600 to 1,800 people, like a kibbutz, called phalanges. Now, nearly all of these, including 40 that were established in America, failed miserably because of a lack of investment, and people couldn't follow all the rules. The next and greatest of the utopian socialists was at once more practical and more idealistic. His name was Robert Owen. Robert Owen also wanted to reorganize society, but he argued that it was in the interest of the factory owners themselves to do the organizing. Robert Owen was a self-made man who rose to be a factory owner himself. He was the son of a Welsh postmaster. In 1780, at age 9, he was apprenticed to a draper. By age 18, he'd saved enough to buy his first textile machinery, and at 20, he rose to be the manager of a Manchester factory. In 1799, he purchased the cotton mills at New Lanark in Scotland, and when he got there, he was appalled at the working and living conditions of the workers. Now, Owen was a man who was convinced that Locke was right, that character was molded by environment, and that providing a good environment would lead to good character. And so he gave his workers decent working hours and conditions, decent housing, schools for their children, hospitals for the sick, churches. In other words, Owen created a model community, a company town built around what was good for its citizens, not just its owners. Remarkably, both productivity and profits shot up. Well, Owen thought he'd figured it out. In 1813, Owen published a new view of society, urging the establishment of similar self-sufficient factory communities. And several Owenite communities were indeed established, including Owen's greatest experiment, 20,000 acres at New Harmony, Indiana, USA. But most of these communities failed. Their leaders lacked Owen's missionary zeal. They suffered from internal greed and corruption, and the hostility of an outside world that did not want to supply them and make them work. They weren't really self-sufficient. They depended on that outside world for raw materials. In 1828, Owen sold New Harmony at a loss of 4/5 of his personal fortune. Clearly, the utopian socialists, unlike the romantics, had plans galore, even some experience at implementing them. These guys knew what they wanted society to look like. But they were largely unable to inspire governments, the middle class, to change society fundamentally. Reasoned arguments were not working. The next group of socialists would apply reason and emotion not to persuade governments or factory owners to play nice, but rather to persuade workers that only they had the power to change their lot, to change society, not through argument, but through revolution. These were the revolutionary socialists. Louis Blanc was arguably the first great revolutionary socialist in the first half of the 19th century. He argued that workers should seek a more just society by revolutionary action. He reformulated Saint-Saëns' doctrine to read, "From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs." But the thinkers who would give the most famous formulation of these doctrines were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Well, if liberalism has a dubious connotation in America, if socialism has a bad name, what are we to make of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels? They started off as fairly typical 19th century middle-class intellectuals, really nice college boys. Engels was the son of a wealthy German factory owner with property in England. When sent to inspect the family's factories in Manchester, young Engels was appalled, and he wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England. This is the book in which he called Manchester the shock city of the industrial age. But Engels didn't know what else to do about this until 1843, when he met Karl Marx. Marx was a student at the University of Berlin, whose liberal writings got him into trouble with the authorities. He was expelled, and he fled to Paris. There, Marx and Engels wrote some of their great works. The first great work is the Communist Manifesto of 1848. They kept writing, developing their ideas over the next 35 years, culminating in Capital, or in German, Das Kapital. By the way, I don't know about you, I much prefer the German, don't you? Doesn't it just sound much more sinister? If you really want to scare your parents, tell them you've been reading Das Kapital. Now, the bedrock of Marx and Engels' thought is the economic or materialistic interpretation of history. According to Marx and Engels, the most important thing about a society, the structure and history of its political, social, and religious institutions, derive fundamentally from its economic structure. In their words, the prevailing mode of economic production and exchange, and the social organization necessarily following from it, form the basis upon which is built up, and from which alone can be explained, the political and intellectual history of that epoch. Now, implied in this is the idea that your politics, your religion, your opinions in history derive from your economic situation. Now, generally, I don't think we like to believe this about ourselves. But let's take a few examples. I mean, how many of us marry outside of our economic rank? How many of us vote against our economic interests? How much time do we all spend talking about and thinking about money? What's that all about if economics is not that important in our lives? In a way, it's kind of ironic that Americans have rejected Marx for who is more materialistic of a society than we are. Marx's theory is known as economic determinism. But how did we get our particular economic interests? Where did our particular economic structure come from? According to Marx and Engels, all human activity, and therefore all human history, is the story of class struggle. It's a struggle not for political supremacy, not for religious belief, not for honor, not for love, but for material resources. Since there's a finite amount of material in the world, the story of human history is the story of the struggle of classes. The haves versus have-nots, master versus slave, patrician versus plebeian, lord versus serf, guildmaster versus journeyman, factory owner versus factory worker. To quote Marx and Engels, in a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended in a revolutionary reconstruction of that society at large. Do you remember Smith's unseen hand bringing benefits to all? Marx sees an unseen war bringing the spoils of victory to the winners alone. Industrialization is only the latest such struggle, one which the factory owners seem to be winning. Now, since the factory owners have many advantages in fighting this war, they have wealth, they have political power, they have the ability to threaten workers' livelihoods. Since the factory owners will never voluntarily relinquish the resources and the means of production, that is, the natural resources and the factories necessary to generate wealth, as they had proved with the utopian socialists. Remember, they had their chance to all become Owen. The only hope for those workers lay in revolution. Revolution to seize the means of production, the factory from the owners, and run it in their own interests. But there's a problem. Revolution is impossible so long as the workers fail to realize that they're in a war, that they're being exploited, that they have far more in common with fellow workers in other countries and in other industries than they do with their boss or the shop foreman. In other words, workers will get nowhere until they realize it's us versus them. Now, unfortunately, according to Marx and Engels, the factory owners and their allies have created all sorts of smokescreens to fool workers into submissive loyalty, most prominently religion, nationalism, and trade unionism. First, religion. Well, this doesn't seem to make sense. How could religion possibly hurt workers? Doesn't it, in fact, help them by giving them clear rules of conduct? Doesn't religion provide charity? By 1844, there were over 450 relief agencies in London, many of them religious. Doesn't religion console workers by promising a heavenly reward for the good, no matter how awful their lot on earth? Now, according to Marx and Engels, that's exactly the problem. Christian morality urges people to submit to authority. It prevents them from questioning their lot or taking aggressive action against their oppressors. Instead, it preaches obedience and fobs off workers with a few crusts of bread on earth and the promise of heaven at the end of a miserable life. Hence Marx's famous assertion that religion is the opiate of the masses. By the way, I once had a professor as an undergraduate who thought that, no, it's now sports. According to Marx, nationalism and patriotism do the same thing. Once again, nationalism and patriotism urge workers to be loyal, respectful, submissive, and unquestioning towards national leaders. They say, your enemies aren't the factory owners. Why, they are fellow Englishmen, or Frenchmen, or Germans, or Americans like you. Your real enemies are those awful foreigners conspiring to reduce your standard of living. If you're an Englishman, the Frenchmen. If you're a Frenchman, the Germans. If you're American workers today, well, I'm going to leave this one up to you. Marx and Engels would argue that warfare inspired by nationalism is one of the great weapons of the ruling class to maintain their power. It increases their profits from the sale of arms and fuel. It gets workers' minds off of their domestic troubles. They're concentrating on hating somebody else. And of course, it kills them. After all, who actually serves in the wars? Generally not the sons and daughters of the rich. Finally, What's wrong with government reforms and trade unions? Don't they at least help workers? Marx and Engels argue that they give the appearance of doing so, but the gains are incremental. Now, anyone from a union family that's ever seen their dad go out on strike for a few pennies or dollars on a contract and had to be explained why that's important will understand this one. In effect, unions and reform movements, like religion, say, be patient. You'll get yours eventually. Work through the system. Things will get better. According to Marx and Engels, all of these institutions deflect workers from their real interests and deter them from their only real hope, revolution. Okay, let's say we get our revolution. What if the revolution happens? Well, here, in my view at least, is where Marx and Engels more or less go off the rails. After the revolution, according to Marx and Engels, everyone would work according to their abilities and be rewarded according to their needs. Since the workers are controlling the means of production, everything's fair. Since everyone would have the necessary material conditions of life, there's enough to go around for everybody, and we're no longer having to keep the factory owner rich, everyone would have enough, and so everyone would be content. So there would be no more class struggle, no more personal strife, no more crime. You wouldn't have to steal that loaf of bread. It would be given to you. A classless society would ensue. Now, since everyone would now be on their best behavior, since their material conditions of life had been satisfied, after a brief interval to set things up, the state would simply wither away. It would no longer be needed to keep people in line. The result would be a workers' paradise, indeed, a paradise for all. It should be obvious what's wrong with this. I'm going to give you my own personal response. Marx has attracted legions of critics, and I refer you to them for even more. First, on the one hand, I think Marx defines humans and human happiness far too narrowly. It's true that we often, many of us, even mostly, do act as if the most important thing in life is money, though if that were true, I'm not quite sure why I became a college professor, but we'll leave that aside. But while economics are clearly more important than people like to admit, they don't explain everybody's actions all the time, or even necessarily most of the time. What about Joan of Arc? What about those utilitarians and Quakers and Anglican clergy who fought against slavery? How did that assist them in the class struggle? I'm sure that you know countless examples of true altruism in your own lives. At the very least, people who've given up their chance at wealth and power to spend more time with their families. People do sometimes act against their own economic self-interest and even reject their own class. On the other hand, I think that Marx also underestimates our greed and materialism by underestimating the Western embrace of individuality. Most of us would agree that we work too hard for too little money. I could always work less for more. So why don't we revolt? Why am I not leading the revolution now? One reason may be that most of us, consciously or unconsciously, have bought the capitalist promise that if we just work hard enough, we can be the factory owner. We can be rich. Why would I want to risk that? Why would I want to risk the possibility that I might someday be able to trade my 1993 Chevy Cavalier in for a Mercedes? Why would I risk that by attacking the status quo? Most of us in a capitalist society hope to someday enjoy it and join it. Moreover, even if we all did decide to risk our potential mansions to engage in revolution, does anyone actually believe that we would all be content with contributing according to our abilities and receiving just according to our needs? That we would abandon individual ambition and competition? In other words, I'm arguing here that even if Marx's logic is correct, his psychology is naive. Whether competitiveness is a matter of human nature or just a habit that's been beaten into us by our society, it strikes me that it wouldn't change overnight, that we wouldn't be able to give it up so easily. Okay, I suspect you know this. It's easy, especially after the disaster of communist totalitarian experiments in the 20th century, to ridicule Marx's utopia as being literally nowhere. But I might argue in his defense that no great philosopher's work is without flaws, and none has ever been implemented with the results that philosopher predicted. Not Plato, not Aquinas, not Rousseau, and not Adam Smith. Remember how liberal capitalism created the conditions that inspired Marx and Engels. It was supposed to create something else. I might argue further that Marx remains one of the most important and influential thinkers in Western history, in part because he was the first one to point out just how important economics is to that history. Before Marx, even with Adam Smith, this course would have been taught very differently. Those 18th century wars about trade and empire would have been taught as being solely about politics and dynastic ambitions. We would have largely ignored the commercial and financial revolutions, the triangular trade, and the human consequences of industrialization. Perhaps even more importantly, if Marx and Engels' cure is worse than the disease, their diagnosis of what they see as the disease, their critique of capitalism, is pretty powerful and sometimes difficult to answer. Is it not the case that sometimes multinational corporations make huge profits from foreign wars? Is it the case that is it not the case that CEOs and shareholders have sometimes placed profits over the welfare of their workers? Do the sons and daughters of those CEOs and shareholders generally serve in the infantry? Ask anyone who's ever worked all his life for a large company only to be laid off and see his or her pension eliminated, how they feel. What do you think the workers who testified to the Sadler Commission would say? Would they see themselves as casualties in a class war? Finally, perhaps more than any other great philosophers, Marx and Engels appeal to the emotions, with a profound sense that there should be social justice for the least powerful members of society. Read Engels' description of working conditions in Manchester. See if you don't become angry, or at least a little bit uncomfortable. It was all very well for old-style liberals to patiently advocate electoral and press reforms, for romantics to rail eloquently against the machine. But can you see why oppressed peoples all across the world responded to Marx and Engels? They say, don't wait for heaven. Don't wait for the ruling elite to give you justice and a comfortable life. Seize them. Unite, revolt, and build a better society now. Now, as you know, for 150 years after Marx, peoples around the globe took that advice. In Russia, in China, in much of Asia, Africa, and South America, with terrible consequences, as we shall see. So why not in the very place that Marx and Engels saw as the laboratory for their great experiment, ripe for revolution, Western Europe? Why did Western Europe never explode in the great Marxist revolution? Well, in fact, Marx did get his revolution in 1848. But he didn't get it in England or in Belgium, the very cradles of the Industrial Revolution. That year saw revolutions in Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy. But those were nationalistic revolutions about the aspirations of their peoples to form countries. Secondarily, they were about liberal freedoms like the vote and a free press, and we'll talk about that in a later lecture. Only in France did the economic slump of 1846-48 produce a revolution against Louis Philippe, uniting workers and middle-class intellectuals and individuals. It began in February of that year. During the June days in Paris, workers formed communes a la Blanc and Marx, and they manned barricades and they fought street battles. They demanded universal suffrage, but when they got it, they were outnumbered. Everybody got suffrage, right? So the workers were outnumbered by the middle class and the peasants, who ended up electing moderates, not communists, to a new National Assembly. In July of 1848, the National Assembly proclaimed France a republic again. The voters then chose as the president of this republic Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the great Napoleon, but a man who espoused liberal views. The Chamber of Representatives, which was created by the new Constitution, was elected by universal male suffrage, far more liberal than any other major country in Europe. But that's it. There was no seizing of the factories, no communal ownership of natural resources and the means of production. No classless society ensued. No workers' paradise dawned. In fact, in 1852, Louis Napoleon, taking a page from his uncle's notebook, declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. At this point, I should explain that Napoleon Bonaparte's son would count as Napoleon II, but he had died. So why didn't Marx get his revolution? Why was 1848, in fact, the last serious revolution in Europe until 1917? I would offer 5 reasons that explain an awful lot of the 19th century, or at least the second half of the 19th century, in Europe, at least Western Europe. Number one, the hard times of the mid-1840s that inspired the Communist Manifesto and the Revolution of 1848 in France ended. Between 1848 and 1871, Europe saw unprecedented economic growth, leading to full employment. That brings me to the second reason for no revolution. Because of full employment, workers were in demand, and they were able to organize. Workers began to form unions, which in an era of high demand for labor were hard to break. Repressive laws, which had previously prohibited unions, were changed to allow workers and unions the right to bargain, the right to strike, and the right to picket. Well, why did the law change? If the law used to say you couldn't form a union, because workers got the vote, and that is my third reason for no Marxist revolution. During the mid-19th century, the middle class finally began to see the logic of enfranchisement. In France, universal manhood suffrage was declared in 1848. Women only got the right to vote after World War II. In Britain, the process was more gradual. There was a series of reform acts in 1867-68 and 1886 let in more and more workers, but universal manhood suffrage only came in 1917-18, about the same time as female householders and university grads over 30 were given the vote. Full suffrage for women as well as men over the age of 21 was not given in Britain until 1928. Now, the vote is obviously important. Once workers got it, politicians had to begin to focus on their concerns, not least because they wanted votes. And so it became a race to see who could do reform the best. So the fourth reason for no Marxist revolution is reform. In France, Louis Napoleon portrayed himself as a great and modern reformer. In fact, during his first decade of power, he censored the press and he exiled and banned the writings of Victor Hugo. But he also encouraged industry with tax breaks, subsidies for big projects like railways, and free trade. Tariff barriers were eliminated. Workers and peasants were aided by progressive social legislation, including the encouragement of affordable housing, town planning to eliminate slums, large-scale public works projects, and improved credit facilities so that peasants could buy land. Napoleon III's greatest public works project was the rebuilding of Paris. Napoleon cleared all sorts of numerous old medieval streets. It was he who laid out those great wide boulevards for which Paris is so famous. Why? Well, he's an emperor and he needs an imperial city, and Paris is certainly now that. It put people to work, and it also ensured that soldiers could march unimpeded down the streets of Paris, as unfortunately the Germans were to prove in 1940. Do you remember all those revolutions? They all started with barricades in the streets of Paris. Well, Napoleon III was not going to fall that way. So Napoleon III presided over a quarter century of prosperity and reform, which reduced the urgency of Marxist call to arms. Britain saw a similar outcome. Successive ministries from different parties vied with each other to see who could win the most votes by enacting the most reform. Liberals under William Ewart Gladstone and conservatives under Benjamin Disraeli pushed through a whole series of proposals. It's a long laundry list: the Sanitation Act of 1868, the Education Acts of 1870 and 1876, the Secret Ballot Act of 1872, the Licensing Act to regulate pubs in 1872. That's why there's last call. The Dwelling Act of 1875, which empowered local governments to pull down slums and erect better housing for the poor. The Food and Drug Acts and Public Health Acts of 1875, which created sanitation codes and regulated ingredients in food and drugs. The Electric Lighting Act of 1872, and above all the Factory Acts of 1874 and 78, which created the 56.5-hour work week, mandated Saturdays off, and provided safer, cleaner working conditions. Now, don't get carried away here. These acts provided no funding for enforcement, and the laws rarely had teeth. Usually the Education and Housing Acts authorized a local authority to do something if they wanted to, but didn't require them to do so. In other words, both parties still know where their bread is buttered. It's buttered by the middle class, and they're going to avoid significantly raising taxes and cutting into profits. But all these factors helped to stave off revolution. They weren't perhaps enough to leave all workers content, and that brings me to the fifth reason there was no Marxist revolution: workers' parties. By the end of the 19th century, urged on by the socialist Edward Bernstein, workers began to support their own socialist political parties, dedicated to their own interests. In 1892, the British Labour Party was founded. In 1905, the United Socialist Party in France. There were already social democrats in Germany. Now, it would be years before these parties actually got enough votes to form a government, and dedicated Marxists saw their formation as a betrayal of the idea of workers' revolution. But I would argue that their very existence was an achievement and a statement. Workers would work within the system to construct their utopia.